Located in the Willamette River just south of downtown Portland lingers Ross Island, or rather the shell of Ross Island, as it spent decades being emptied out for use as gravel. But once it was a full island, and much like now, uninhabited by people. Sure, people have gone there, but it's rare anyone's there long term. This takes us back to 1912, a year where Portland found itself blossoming with possibilities, alas, none of which came to fruition. Edward Bennett, a prominent city planner and architect, came to Portland during this year and put out a master plan for the city going into the future, complete with a major shift towards European architecture. Most of these ideas, at least in their entirety, were never completed, but at least people were thinking, and sometimes reaching for the stars, hoping a paradise would result from it. And most of the time, as is often the case, it came down to a matter of money. One of the ideas to at least reach its peak in 1912 was a short-lived idea to convert Ross Island into a paradise of its own, out on the river. As with many things, I stumbled onto this story by chance on the fantastic picture blog Vintage Portland, where they displayed a map of an idea for a park covering the whole island and what that park might look like. It would have been impressive, with a bridge crossing the river to the island's north end, allowing for access to the island from there. There was already a push at this time to have a South Portland Bridge built across the river in this vicinity, a push that ultimately resulted in the aptly named Ross Island Bridge being constructed in 1926. In the middle of this planned bridge, there would be an overlook place, providing a nice view of the city, and next to it an offshoot leading people onto the island. This offshoot would hit the main path, known as the Greeting, which would have cut down the middle of the island. There would be two other paths, one hooking down the west side of the island and the other hooking down the east side. The path going down the east side would lead to a point where people could access the island by boat and station their watercrafts there. If one walked down the middle of the park, you would pass by some croquet courts, followed by tennis courts. And so much of this would have been surrounded and almost engulfed by trees to add a foresty vibe to the place, and also possibly give off an essence that you were far away from the city somewhere. Perhaps my favorite part of the plan was what was set for the southern end of the island. At this point, there would be a massive open space referenced as the playfield, leading me to believe it may have served some kind of baseball purpose. But to the south end of this field was what was listed as a concert pavilion, indicating a variety of different performances could have been held there, likely using the playfield as the gathering place for spectators. There would be a variety of other possibilities suggested for this area as well, which I will get into as I tell the story of this park that was never to be. This would have been a massive complex, even larger than this map makes it appear. Despite, again, mostly being whittled away by years of sand and gravel removal, one can still see how massive Ross Island is today. I walked past it while out shooting video for my Inner Urban Trolley video, and every time I felt I had to be reaching the end of the island, it just kept going. And for the sake of the full story on this park's idea, it's important to realize that there are technically 4 islands. There's Ross Island, of course, but The southeastern portion of the same island body is referred to as Hardtack Island, but these two would not become connected until the 1920s when a levee was built to connect the two. Back in the 1910s, there were still 4 distinct islands. Between Hardtack Island and the east shore of the river is a smaller island called East Island, and to the southwest of Ross Island is a very small one called Toe Island. Project ideas going into the 1920s, some related to this park idea, would try and make use of all 4 of these islands. As far as it is known, the original idea for converting Ross Island into a park came from what was called the Olmstead Plan, or the Portland Park Plan. This plan was put together by a landscape architect named John Charles Olmstead, who was part of a large firm called the Olmstead Brothers. Olmstead arrived in Portland in the spring of 1903 and spent many months examining a city that itself had noted their lack of a comprehensive park system. Olmstead covered everything from where new parks should be, how to obtain land for these parks, how to maintain them, and being prepared for the future of Portland as a growing city. While his report is regarded as being put out in 1904, he technically turned it into the city on December 31st, 1903. Among the many places Olmstead suggested as possible park space, he included the establishment of a park on Ross Island. While acknowledging that the island was often submerged for a time in the winter by floodwaters, he called it a prime site for recreation during the summer. And even by 1912, the addition of rocks around the outer edge of the island was discussed in an effort to elevate the land and hold back possible flooding. Olmstead also noted that the river could be deepened around the island, and the land removed to deepen it could be used to elevate the banks along the island. For the time, the island could be accessed by ferry, but Olmstead too noted how a bridge could eventually be made to access it. But despite the depth and usefulness of this plan, few of the ideas from it would ultimately be pursued. But Ross Island, as a park idea, would lie dormant only for a couple of years when it was briefly revived by the city's rowing club suggesting it be converted into a park. The city's rowers often pass through this area on the river, and even today you can spot rowers in the vicinity of Ross Island. The island was sitting there, unused, and it was also noted that the city, despite a river cutting right through the middle of it, did not have a real riverside park. And Ross Island could serve as a park with the river all around it. Despite this push, nothing ever came of it, and the matter quickly faded away. Until 1911, when the notion was suddenly revived again, with a major push by a pivotal character in this whole story, Alan Rushlight, Portland's mayor from 1911 to 1913. With the idea growing, a piece published in a publication called Pacific Coast Architect stated there were about 261 acres of lawn area available on the island, as well as some 40,000 feet of walks. And while the island appeared empty and unused by this time, it had a fairly robust history. A good amount of this was published in a short editorial piece in the October 30th, 1912 edition of the Oregonian. A local named George Langford was responding to claims at this time that the island was mostly swampland by pointing out those who had previously inhabited the space. It was originally owned by a Sherry Ross through a donation land claim, just a fancy term for land stolen from the natives. Over the years, it would be used as farmland and also as a space for multiple dairies. And the people that ran these lived there on the island, so it was hardly inhabitable swampland. A 1904 article noted that the island was once the site of one of Portland's most notorious resorts, where crime ran rampant. In the aftermath of this resort burning down, the island's owner, who you'll be introduced to shortly, refused to let them rebuild there. And also, while it would hardly be mentioned over the duration of this particular park story, through the 1910s into the early 20s, there was a swimming and dance spot out there on the island, which would be closed down when the Willamette's water was deemed too contaminated. On October 21st, 1911, it was reported that the island had officially been made available for sale to the city after Mayor Rushlight secured a 6-month option on the island from its owner, John Kiernan. And John Kiernan was not just another random property owner around town. Arriving in the Portland area back in the 1860s and becoming prominent in the salmon packing industry while owning multiple lumber and sawmills, he would also serve as the president of the Oregon Transfer Company, while running for multiple local positions, including sheriff and city treasurer. He was also very much involved in investing in real estate, hence his ownership of Ross Island, which he would ultimately own for more than 50 years, having originally purchased it in 1872. But by this time, in late 1911, Kiernan was pushing 70 years of age and looking to sell. The details of the option established between Kiernan and Rushlight stated that the property could go for as much as $300,000. A lofty price, but this was also the ceiling amount that would be paid. The plan was then to put this option to buy the island for conversion into a park on a January 1912 ballot for the voters to decide on. And, in typical style, especially for the time, a small work prison was set to be built out there on the island, allowing for prisoners to be stationed there and to be used for cheap labor to work on the island. This ballot would also include a vote on a bridge that would be erected close by, reportedly at a peak cost of $800,000. It was also felt a bridge this far south would benefit those living in the southeastern portion of town. However, a previous bond had been voted on in relation to this South Portland Bridge, and was roundly defeated. But beyond these two items, there was a third critical element at play here. The city's incinerator, currently located in the Gilds Lake area, the open land left over from the aftermath of the massive Lewis and Clark exposition, was woefully deficient in terms of handling the trash of this growing city. Refuse was backing up and the smell of rubbish was floating throughout the area. It was thought if this incinerator could be relocated to Hardtack Island, accessible by a bridge from Ross Island, a larger incinerator could be built, and being out on an island, less of the smell would make it to the city's residents. This was somewhat presumptuous, as this island is not far from the river's eastern shoreline, and it would also be close to Ross Island, meaning trash would have been burning in close proximity to this massive park. But regardless, when it came to the incinerator, the city was in an ever-increasingly desperate situation, and East Island was their best option. And it was felt another small work-type prison could be made out there, and that prisoners could be used to help dispose of some of the trash. But these would all have to wait, as instead of going on a ballot at the start of 1912, these items would not appear on one until the November election of that year. So while Woodrow Wilson would be elected our new president in a victory over Theodore Roosevelt and incumbent William Howard Taft, Portland was trying to create a park, find a better place for their trash, and build a bridge to reach all of that. It would be February 11th, 1912, that the first detailed outline of this park, complete with a diagram, would be published in newspapers. Beyond the negatives of, say, potential flooding at times, the benefits were many. It was right in the middle of the city, the land was mostly flat, making travel simple, and high acreage allowed for there to be lots of people in the park at the same time. The location where boats would be able to dock would be, oddly enough, named Mosquito Harbor. Beyond filling in and elevating land on the island to avoid flooding, the plan was to construct a recessed area upon the island, allowing for high waters to flow into it. Thus, during high water season, this would appear as a small lake. Mayor Rushlight and many others in city government, as well as local businessmen, most people of prominence, supported the park idea and did what they could to get the voters behind it. But there was one critical red flag in all of this that locals caught on to pretty quick. While voting in favor of purchasing Ross Island could cost the city upwards of $300,000, it was found that the island property itself was assessed to a value of just over $30,000. So what was the city doing even considering the notion of possibly paying almost 10 times what the land was worth? This came during a time where the voters in Portland were very apprehensive about expensive projects, hence rejecting a South Portland Bridge idea once already. Many locals felt there had to be land elsewhere for much less money. The flooding issue was also a concern for them. Doing their best to protect the island from flooding would cost even more money, and after the finances it would take to construct this beautiful park, all it would take was one good flood to wreck everything. It was a risk. No amount of altering the land on that island could guarantee 100% protection against the next great flood. Despite these setbacks, the leaders of the city felt the lure of the park, the benefits of another bridge, and the necessity of an incinerator would sway voters in the right direction. And they would stay in the ears of voters to the very end. Another diagram of the park would also be released, quite different from the February one, including a South Portland Bridge no longer connected to the north end of the island, but rather with an off-ramp that led down to it. And finally, the other small tow island was set to have a small bridge lead to it, as that was the planned site for a new contagion hospital. It was going to be a posh, flashy, well-to-do park. Just pay no attention to the massive piles of trash and the deathly sick people being transported through there every day. This was all becoming a very interesting example of what you might call, I guess, mixed-use islands. November 2nd, 1912, Election Day. On a ballot that had several measures on it, most of them faced defeat. Another prime example of the citizens of the city keeping a tight hold on their pocketbooks. Despite all the support thrown behind it by city personnel, the measure that faced the widest margin of defeat, the measure to purchase Ross Island. Nearly 80% of voters turned it down. The final count, 5,104 yes votes, 20,051 no votes. The measure to obtain funding for a new South Portland Bridge didn't fare much better, with the no's more than doubling the yeas. With no purchase of Ross Island, this also killed plans for a new incinerator location. What's more is less than 50% of voters actually turned out for this special election. Some were shocked, especially Mayor Rushlight, who was quoted afterwards to say, "I deeply regret that the Ross Island and South Portland Bridge projects were defeated. I believe the people will regret their action, too. Ross Island offered solution to many municipal problems, in addition to settling the question of a site for a new refuse incinerator." Superintendent of the Guild Lake Incinerator, D.E. Otis, was a bit more forward, stating the people would regret their decision come the heat of summer with that stench of cooking garbage in the air. Another council person staked the claim that not paying up the cash for the island was foolish, as Ross Island would be worth about $2 million in 10 years. You know, the $31,000 island. But the thing was, the people weren't against a better incinerator, a new spacious park, a new bridge. They were against the extravagant costs. But it seemed like city personnel felt the people were just delusional. Everything costs money, and thus not everything gets to happen. Within 2 days of these failed measures, there was already a push to call them back up for a summer 1913 election, despite facing such heavy defeats. Mayor Rushlight asked the city council to give him power to establish a 15-person committee to investigate the Rose Island and incinerator projects. He stood from the position that, despite how often these projects were promoted, that the people must have not fully understood them, or they most certainly would have voted in favor of them. It seemed like there was some serious denial going on here, and nobody wanted to address the money issue. And while Rushlight made a push to establish this committee, he was dealt another blow. Reported on November 15th, less than 2 weeks after the election, island owner John Kiernan posted a brief in the papers that he had taken the sale of the island off the table. The note specifically said, "Since there has been so much said about Ross Island as to its value and what it has been offered at by the owner, I wish to state that the island has been withdrawn from the market, and if the city wants it, it will get it through condemnation proceedings and not otherwise." It seemed Kiernan was a little bit salty following the unsuccessful election, and probably after hearing lots of locals calling out the absurd price suggested for his property. Still, Mayor Rushlight got his committee, and they drew the same conclusions as he did. The citizens had just not been given all the pertinent information, or else they would have voted differently. While this does sound a bit presumptuous, the legitimate point was made that it wasn't made fully clear that the worst case scenario would be the city paying $300,000 for Ross Island, but what the city actually paid could have been substantially less. Even with this, I don't know if this would sway voters much, as they would be voting yes on something where the actual money spent was unknown. But even with his own office up for election in June 1913, Rushlight wanted these items back on the ballot at that time as well. Certainly the citizens would come to their senses this time around. And by this time, the incinerator situation had become so dire in the minds of local city government that it had overtaken the park idea in terms of significance, but to get the land for one would include getting the land for the other, and thus the projects remained linked. Come April, less than 2 months before the vote, an $850,000 bond for the South Portland Bridge construction and a $200,000 bond for the new incinerator was called for, along with plans to provide funds for acquiring Ross Island, with the main focus still being that it would become a park. It appears they had taken John Kiernan's condemnation words to heart, as now the actual amount to be spent was listed as to be determined by a jury in condemnation proceedings. That said, it was believed $300,000 would still be the maximum amount paid. The city also acknowledged that the incinerator bond could pass without the Ross Island one passing, even though this would delay the construction of said incinerator. So it behooved voters to support both if they supported one. Otherwise, they were voting for a few $100,000 to be allocated for a project with no definitive starting date. With locals already suspicious with how the local city government was spending money, I get the feeling many would have not loved this idea. Another $2 million was also called for in park and playground bonds for fixing up and maintaining the city's parks, and would have also included funds to construct that park on Ross Island. But with things on the move and the city still backing a new bridge, park, and an incinerator, as I researched ahead into June when this major election took place, I suddenly found myself finding no information about the vote in relation to Ross Island. Well, I would then discover that in a May 9th special session of the City Council, a motion was made by then councilperson and future controversial four-term Mayor George Baker to withdraw the purchase of Ross Island from the June ballot. His reasoning for this was that it had been placed on there in bad faith. It seemed to rub him the wrong way from the beginning that a project so mercilessly defeated only months earlier should be forced on the people again, who had made their perspectives quite clear. His motion was carried by a unanimous vote of the council during that session. It was during this time that Mayor Rushlight's motives were also called into question, as he was obviously not elated that the Ross Island purchase was taken off the ballot. There were claims that he would have financially benefited from the island's purchase, something he openly denied. When the council agreed to drop the island from the ballot, he reiterated the same sentiment he had after the previous November election, stating, "The people of this city will be sorry someday that they did not purchase that island." Maybe he wasn't wrong. By this time, there were further changes made to the overall plans for these islands on the Willamette. Along with the park and the incinerator, Mayor Rushlight had also suggested using land there for a water department supply station, a crematory, and a woman's detention home. There was also suggestions to use island space for a street repair plant, which is quite interesting considering what the island space would be primarily used for in the decades to come. Of course, a park was still in the plans, but being what was the initial focus for this area, it had taken a back seat to other, newer projects. Come June 2nd, Election Day again, Alan Rushlight would be defeated in the mayoral election and replaced by H. Russell Albee. While the incinerator bond would pass, likely from the amount of pressure put on it, along with general acceptance that this was an issue in immediate need of attention, the South Portland Bridge bond would once again be heavily defeated, along with the bond for the area's parks, meaning no Ross Island, and little to no money to erect the park with. And money established for a new incinerator with no set location for construction. It was a bit of a mess, but another reminder from voters that they were not going to blindly support every bond thrown at them, especially if it was going to cost a bundle. The incinerator, despite the desperation of this time, remained in the Guild Lake area for nearly 20 more years, and always seemingly in need of replacement. The city would delay the inevitable by burying a great deal of trash in one of many landfills around town during the 1920s, But the problem was never going to go away, and in the summer of 1930, the chimney of the incinerator began to crack, forcing a shutdown while a new one was built. Finally, the incinerator would find a new home in 1932 in the St. John's neighborhood, a site affectionately known today as Chimney Park. Back in 2018, when I was exploring the general area, I caught a little of the incinerator building that still exists there today, having no idea at the time what the building had been used for. As far as anyone knew, this June 1913 vote was the end of the park matter. The idea faded away and the island just sat there, uninhabited, with an owner still hoping to sell. One day. Then, come September 1921, it was reported that the city government had funding to the tune of $360,000 that needed to be expended specifically on land to be used for park space. Suddenly, the Ross Island Park idea was brought back from the dead. It was noted most parks in the area, aside from maybe Washington Park, were relatively small, and the city needed their own, quote, central park, which Ross Island could have represented. Large ball fields could be made. There was no main aquatic center in town, which this island could have easily included. It was thought a park comparable to Detroit's Belle Isle could have been erected out there. And for a moment, people were suddenly revived and getting excited about this park idea. John Kiernan still owned the island and was holding out for that $300,000 payday, but noted, under the right conditions, he could let it go for less. Almost as quickly as everyone was getting excited again, it was learned that this was all just a misunderstanding. The city did not just have $360,000 laying around, but rather had it in unused bonds, and those bonds were to be specifically used for park improvements and nothing else. So, someone got some bad intel on that one. The city, at best, had around $100,000 available for land purchases in relation to erecting new parks, some of which had already been allocated to other projects, and Ross Island was unlikely to go for that cheap anyway. And once the island was bought, extensive money would be needed just to construct everything out there. It was back to the same problems that were had a decade earlier. Money. Despite this defeat before anything actually got off the ground, in August 1923, the idea came about again. With time, Kiernan had been getting more and more driven to sell off this land, and it was felt the city should strike while this opportunity remained. Alas, this never went anywhere. It was just some talk, and the following summer, Kiernan was finally closing a deal on selling the island to be used as a large auto camp. The island would go for $200,000 to the recently established Ross Island Park Corporation. This auto camp was to include 100 small rental homes, stores, recreation opportunities, and even a movie theater. And the cost? $1 a day plus 50 cents for general use of the park. So, honestly, not too far off from what the original plan was. It would almost be like a mini 1920s version of Sun River, which, if you're not from the area, Sun River is a community near Bend in Central Oregon, noted for its nice homes and extensive recreation. A prime spot for people to vacation. I had the fortune of staying there once back in 2020. But then, come the spring of 1925, the idea of the city purchasing this island was once again up for consideration. The auto camp plan, which reached an advanced stage and was believed all but done, ultimately fell through. Still, the idea was to purchase it for a park that some wanted to call Rose Isle. However, this name was rejected by the city, as the name Ross given to the island was tied to a local pioneer family. But again, this ties back to a donation land claim. In a letter by a Joseph Teal, a main figure in pushing the purchase of this island for years, noted his opposition to this name change by saying there was much to be lost by changing the names which represent and commemorate our traditions and, in many instances, our pioneer fathers. And later, he'd say that it should be constantly kept in mind to, quote, revere and maintain the names and traditions of the pioneers who laid the foundations for Oregon and for this city. Sorry, but that just sounds a bit like erasure of native history, don't you think? Just a little bit? The foundations for the land that would become Oregon had been established long before these 1800s pioneers came along. That's not to negate all the effects these pioneers had in Portland, as well as Oregon. The hope was to purchase the island for around $235,000 and to use it as the main headquarters for the city's Rose Festival activities. Somewhat similar to the previously planned auto camp, it was noted they wanted to convert the island to a resort on the river. So sure, the park element was still there, but with a transition into the 1920s, the objective became more about having a posh, almost elite space over the simple space for various recreational activities that was originally planned. Discussions were had, but this too never happened. And after years of often faint possibilities, any hope of the land becoming converted into a park or any other kind of recreational space ended come March 1926. At this time, John Kiernan finally sold off the property to the company J.O. Elrod and Associates for the amount of $215,000. Remember that councilman stating that Ross Island would be worth $2 million in 10 years? Well, here we were, almost 15 years later, and the land went for tens of thousands less than it had been optioned for back then. By the summer, it would be the Ross Island Sand and Gravel Company taking full control of the island. Such would begin the many decades of removing gravel from the island, as back then at the beginning it was felt there were about 15 million yards worth of gravel available there. And obviously, once the island was sold off for this purpose, there was more regret to go around with regards to the city never buying this island. One short piece called this out in a way that was very common in the early 20th century, noting how much the city would grow in the coming years. It's important to remember that a major population boom happened in those early decades, but it was presumed at this time that Portland was guaranteed to one day have over 1 million people, and soon. Even today, Portland stands at just over 630,000 people. But it still made a point that as the city grew, where would all the parks be if the city and its people couldn't make them happen? With what ended up happening, it's a real mixed bag, as the gravel taken from here was significant towards so many construction projects over the years in the city of Portland. But it also killed off the majority of an island. While it does stray from the subject matter, I wanted to include a few of the discoveries I made while out shooting video for this film. I noticed along the way a large number of long since forgotten items, easily missed, even if you're on the nearby trail. This is like it looks like a pier of sorts. And there's another one. I wonder what was here. There's definitely something. I don't know what was here. This might be related to, because I know that the
business that was here, sand and gravel business, whatever. You know, obviously, but I swear it's further up the road. So I don't really know. I'm just wondering if maybe this is associated with that, because I just don't know. Don't know what else to be used for. It's a cool sighting. And there keep being discoveries to be made. I don't know if I've ever seen these. I've been down the trail here before. I've never paid attention. I'm here trying to focus on Ross Island, and I'm seeing all this old stuff down here. Long since abandoned. And there's just lots of, along the way, when there's not something this big, there's these just hunks of concrete down the hillside, and there's more over there. That's got an American flag and a ladder hanging on it. I'm guessing some citizen did that. That wasn't done by somebody paid by the city. There's even, like, this actually looks like it may have been steps once upon a time leading down there, at least to this point. Yeah, stuff is freaking everywhere. There's another, like, you know, pier kind of shape. It's got all the old pieces of metal sticking out. And you got old glory with a ladder and some stuff. Is that like some, I don't know, there's a lot going on. That actually, it looks like somebody's fashioned like some kind of homemade satellite dish looking thing there. To each their own. Then you turn and there's this. Again, I just stumbled onto this. I do not know what this is or why it's here. I've seen things like that down by, like, a little further down Oaks Bottom area. Nature, reclaiming. Just a little side piece to me coming down shooting footage of Ross Island for this video, and then just seeing some extra stuff.
And while walking through here, just downhill from where the main sand and gravel building is, I did not realize that to the left of the path there was once an aerial tramway built in 1926 to transport sand and gravel from Hardtack Island to the bluffs above, to then be distributed around town. Despite the strong transformation of this island space over many, many years, in recent years an effort has been put in place to convert the location into a nature area, a place where the creatures of the land there can truly flourish. So the idea of a park, in a sense, may ultimately be this location's fate, granted more than 100 years after park plans were considered, and this would be an oasis for the animals as opposed to people, which would be good. We've certainly taken away enough of their land. While rehabilitation efforts at this location go back to the late 1970s, only now in the 21st century has the real work begun. In 2004, Ross Island Sand and Gravel ceased mining the site due to the effects had on local fish life. And in 2007, 45 acres of the island were donated to the city, with 2 acres on the north end donated by the Port of Portland in 2015. Alas, toxic fill from the past as well as current toxic algae in the area have made it difficult, and this is a transition that will not be complete overnight. But at least things are heading in the right direction, and when all is said and done, one can only hope the residents of this island on the Willamette can fully flourish once again.